If you had just 3 minutes to change a judge's view of justice, what would you do? In 2025, inside a federal courtroom in San Francisco, a woman stood before one of the toughest judges in the state. No lawyer, no defense, no plea for leniency. Her name was Maria Lopez. They called her a protest instigator, a threat to public order, a nuisance activist. But that day, she didn't come to defend herself. She came to tell a story written in the worn-out diary of a mother who had died. And in just 3 minutes, what Maria read out loud brought the entire courtroom to silence. Jurors wept. Reporters put down their pens. Police officers bowed their heads. And the man who had once charged her, Judge Samuel Carter, for the first time in 3 decades, took off his robe of power and listened like a human being. Behind that moment was a painful truth. Thousands of letters from mothers who lost their children to police violence had never been read. Not one reply, not one mention in court. They were forced into silence, filed under irrelevant evidence. Until one daughter, the girl who once lived under the roof of one of those mothers, decided to break that silence, right in the place that had once ignored their voices. This wasn't just a trial. This was a confrontation between power and truth, between law and memory, between a system built to judge and a woman who only wanted to be heard. What Maria Lopez did isn't taught in any law program. She didn't break the system. She forced it to face itself. And when someone dares to bring truth into the courtroom as living evidence, no one, not even a judge, can stay unmoved. She didn't win the trial. She changed it. And then she vanished. If this story made you think, leave a comment below. Like if you believe justice begins with listening. Subscribe so you never miss a story that changes how you see the world. On Monday morning, the city of San Francisco woke not to the sound of streetcars or sirens, but to the buzzing chatter surrounding a courtroom event the media had dubbed history unwritten. Even before the sun pierced through the thick fog hanging over the hills, crowds had gathered outside the federal courthouse at Civic Center. Some held hand-painted protest signs. Others stood silently, clutching black and white photographs of lost loved ones. Most of them victims of police violence. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. They weren't just here to witness a trial. They came to see whether someone would dare to speak the truth in a place once called a temple of law, but for far too long had echoed without a trace of conscience. On the third floor, courtroom number 3, reserved for the most serious federal cases, was being meticulously prepared. The microphones were tested 3 times. The judge's bench wiped down with damp cloths. The flags of California and the United States aligned with perfect symmetry. This was the routine of the chief clerk, who had served under Judge Samuel Carter for nearly 15 years. She knew his preferences, everything neat, exact, without excess, just like how he ran his court, unshaken, unemotional, never straying beyond the lines drawn by law. Samuel Carter, age 63, was a seasoned judge, a top graduate of Stanford Law, appointed to the federal bench during the George W. Bush administration, and never once seriously challenged on any of his rulings. He was respected by conservatives, deferred to by law enforcement, and described by the press as the cold stone pillar of old-school justice. To him, truth was what the law wrote, and law was no place for personal feelings. Today, he would preside over a most unusual trial, not because of the charges, but because of the defendant, Maria Lopez. For years, her name had sparked controversy. To residents of the Mission District, especially within the Latinx and immigrant communities, Maria was a hero, a woman who stood in the streets, pointed at police stations, and declared, "We are not afraid of you." But to city officials, segments of the media, and certainly to men like Carter, she was a nuisance, someone who chose noise over dialogue, an agitator, not an advocate. Maria Lopez had been summoned on charges of inciting civil unrest during a peaceful protest that turned chaotic in the Tenderloin district, home to the city's highest rates of homelessness and arrests. In a viral video, Maria could be seen standing atop a car, holding a megaphone shouting, "We can't keep waiting for people who never listen." Moments later, chaos broke out. A police car's windows were shattered. An officer was pushed to the ground. Under federal Homeland Security law, incitement in a crowd could be prosecuted as a criminal offense. and with a single subpoena, Carter could order Maria to appear in court. But one detail set this case apart. Maria didn't hire a lawyer. She didn't contest the summons. She didn't rally protests online. No live streams calling out the system. Just one line posted to social media 3 days before the hearing. Some trials don't need lawyers, just the truth. 8:46 a.m., a black, unmarked SUV pulled up to the courthouse steps. Maria stepped out. No bodyguards, no assistants, no film crew. She wore a charcoal gray shirt, black jeans, hair tied high, and carried a faded canvas backpack. No makeup, no accessories. Her face seemed unremarkable, except for her eyes. Eyes that showed no fear, but also didn't defy. They belonged to someone used to being watched, judged, and no longer fazed by it. Outside, the crowd broke into applause. No chants, no shouting, just applause. A long, steady rhythm. As if everyone knew that today's words were not to be noise, but an echo of voices long stifled. As Maria entered the courtroom, Samuel Carter was already seated. He didn't look up as she passed. No nod, no reaction. Just flipped through the case file, like a professor about to grade a failing paper. 9:03 a.m., the clerk announced the start of the hearing. Carter looked directly at the defendant, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maria Lopez," he began, "you are summoned here by order of the federal court under charges of inciting public disorder, obstructing government operations, and posing potential threats to national security. You have the right to remain silent, but should you choose to speak, everything you say will be entered into record. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maria answered. Her voice was soft but clear. "Do you choose to be represented by counsel?" "Number Y will speak for myself." "Very well. This court will permit you 3 minutes to speak. If you exceed that limit or stray off topic, proceedings will be paused and enforcement measures may be taken." After a pause, Carter added sharply, "I hope you understand that this is a federal courtroom, not a stage." Maria pressed her lips together, but didn't reply. She slowly opened her backpack and pulled out a small leather notebook, its cover worn, pages curled as if once soaked. She placed it gently on the table in front of her, like setting down something sacred. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm not here to perform, and I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to give testimony, not mine, but from someone who cannot be here, and I will speak on her behalf." Carter squinted. "And who is that?" Maria paused, then rested her hand on the notebook's cover, like holding something on the verge of breaking. "A mother," she said, "who sent this journal to your chambers 7 years ago." The air in the room shifted. Reporters flipped through notepads. Some looked at each other, exchanging glances. The court clerk typed quickly into the record. In the back right corner, a security officer touched his radio. Carter sat still, lips tightened. He didn't remember that detail. Or perhaps he did but didn't want to. "You never read it," Maria continued, "and so today I will read it for you, if the court allows." The room fell utterly silent. Outside, thousands watched the live stream, on phones, TVs, laptops, feeling in real time that something was shifting. This would not be a courtroom like the others. And Maria Lopez, the woman once branded a provocateur, had just turned the coldest hall of justice into a stage for something far more sacred than argument. Raw emotion. But no one yet knew that the notebook wasn't just a bundle of tear-stained pages from a grieving mother. It was a mirror, reflecting back on the very verdicts Samuel Carter thought he had buried in silence. Judge Samuel Carter clasped his hands tightly in front of him. In a courtroom where the sound of a gavel often marked the end of someone's fate, something today felt different, even to him, a man who had presided over thousands of cases. Before him stood a young, slender woman. No lawyer, no defense files, just an old notebook. And in just a few minutes, she had silenced the entire courtroom, as if no one dared to even breathe. Carter wasn't easily rattled. He had stood face to face with armed criminals, wept on by desperate witnesses, and judged high-profile national cases. But Maria Lopez wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. There was something in her eyes, not defiance, not quite hope, but a terrifying certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from someone speaking on behalf of those who no longer can. Carter raised his hand, signaling the clerk to mute the courtroom live stream for 10 seconds. A rare signal, typically reserved for internal security concerns. He looked directly at Maria, his voice steady and clear, but now with a deeper, graver tone. I'll ask you only once, Ms. Lopez. Does the content you're about to present relate directly to the charges in this case? Maria didn't blink. Yes, Your Honor, because the so-called charges cannot be separated from what I've witnessed. And what I've witnessed begins with this journal. So you're suggesting that the events in Tenderloin, where a police officer was injured and a patrol car destroyed, were caused by words in that notebook? No, sir. I'm saying the events in Tenderloin were the result of years of a system refusing to hear voices like the ones in this notebook. I didn't start the storm. I just pointed to the cloud. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several journalists hurried to jot down her exact words. On social media, even the brief 10-second live stream cut was enough to spark a frenzy. What's happening inside courtroom 3? Carter tapped his gavel lightly, not harshly, but just enough to suppress the growing internal unrest even within himself. I will not be drawn into a moral lecture here, he said, eyes fixed on Maria. This courtroom is not a social forum. It is a place for the interpretation and application of law. And under the law, you are charged with inciting a crowd, leading to serious consequences for public order. Maria showed no surprise. She was used to being accused, especially by men in black robes. Your Honor, she said, I'm not here to preach. I'm here to ask a question. Carter frowned. A question? He repeated almost mockingly. Maria nodded. If a mother, after losing her child in a police shooting, wrote dozens of letters, sent hundreds of pleas, and finally mailed this journal to your chambers, and received no reply, then when she dies, who has the right to speak on her behalf? For a brief second, confusion flashed in Carter's eyes. Just for a second, but Maria saw it. He quickly adjusted his posture, voice tightening again. This court is here to rule on a specific charge. Personal grief, no matter how tragic, is not grounds to bend the law. Maria stepped closer to the witness podium. Then allow me to ask another question, sir. If a system consistently dismisses personal grief, does that system still deserve to be called justice? This time, no one laughed. No one scoffed. Even a reporter who had previously branded her an impractical activist lowered her camera. Maria continued, not raising her voice, not shedding a tear, but each sentence pierced the air like a blade. I didn't break the law. I broke the silence. I didn't destroy anything. I merely spoke out what countless others were forced to swallow for years. If I'm to be convicted for that, I accept it. But you cannot convict this notebook, because the words inside weren't written by me. Carter leaned back in his chair, eyes still locked on her. He was trying to determine whether there was strategy behind her words, or if she truly came only to voice the pain of a woman now gone. He felt the weight pressing down on him. The city was watching, the state government was watching, and if he ruled too harshly, he'd be painted a tyrant. But if he let her speak freely, he risked setting a precedent, one where raw emotion might overshadow legal reasoning. I don't care who wrote what's in that journal, he said coldly. Without legal evidence to accompany it, it holds no weight in this trial. Maria nodded, as if she had expected it. You're right, sir, but sometimes what matters most isn't written in law. It's what the law has never dared to acknowledge. Carter raised his hand to the clerk. Record this. The defendant is waiving legal representation, self-advocating, and presenting informal personal material. The court will proceed in order, but her statements will be limited in scope. He paused, then looked directly at Maria. You have 3 minutes to present anything you believe relevant. If you go off topic after that, security will intervene. Maria glanced at the wall clock behind him. 9:23 a.m. She placed both hands on the notebook and opened to the first page. The handwriting was delicate, ink blurred in places, as if written during a sleepless night, hands trembling. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she began to read. April 6th. Today would have been your 18th birthday, but you're not here. I didn't buy a cake, I didn't buy candles. I bought a notebook. To write. To write so you can hear me. Because I'm afraid that if I don't write, I'll forget the sound of your voice. The room froze. Pens stopped midair. A young female journalist brought her hand to her mouth. A court officer. No one could tell whether he was wiping his glasses or his tears. But Maria didn't stop. And what she read next would force even Judge Samuel Carter to confront a decision he thought he'd buried 7 years ago. 9:24 a.m. Courtroom number 3 remained in utter silence. Not the usual silence of a typical trial, but something far thicker, an almost physical stillness, as if time itself were being slowed by each word Maria Lopez read aloud. Her voice wasn't loud, nor overly theatrical, but each syllable landed with precision, as if the writer herself had returned to speak before everyone. It was a kind of testimony no legal system could suppress. Memory. April 6th, today is your 18th birthday, but you're not here. I didn't buy cake. I didn't buy candles. I only bought a notebook. To write. I don't know what to write first. I'm afraid that if I don't, I'll forget the sound of your laughter. I'm afraid that if I stay silent, people will forget you ever existed. Carter sat motionless. His hands rested on the bench, and his thumb twitched slightly, an old habit of his whenever he tried to suppress emotion. But his eyes didn't leave Maria, partly to monitor time, but he knew, partly because he was listening, truly listening. Maria turned to the next page, her head still down. My son died on March 12th. They called it an accident, but a bullet doesn't fire itself. A gun doesn't load itself. A boy without a weapon cannot be considered a threat. So why was the officer cleared after just 3 weeks? A sharp exhale came from the left bench. A middle-aged woman covered her face with a tissue. A young attorney in the press section bowed his head to the table, eyes shut, as if absorbing every word. Maria paused, not to catch her breath, but to allow the space to fully absorb each sentence. Do you know, son? I filed a complaint. I submitted documents, wrote letters by hand, sent emails, faxes. I went alone to the federal courthouse and stood outside the office door of a man named Samuel Carter. The moment that name was spoken, the room seemed to hold its breath. Maria looked up directly at Carter. Not in anger, not with resentment. It was a look anyone who's lost someone to violence would recognize. The gaze of a person who has nothing left to lose. You didn't respond, she said. Not a single line. No reply. No promise to review. Not a single phone call from anyone. Only one stamp. Received. Insufficient grounds for review. That's how you ended a mother's plea for help. Carter remained upright, eyes on the notebook. But this time, his lips tightened slightly. He remembered. Not the mother's name, but the file. A complete case file, clearly presented, accompanied by a carefully sealed handwritten letter. He had read it, skimmed it rather, and per procedure, had signed off on its dismissal due to insufficient grounds for reinvestigation. No personal note, no humane response. To him, it had been a routine Thursday. To her, it was the day her last hope died. Maria continued. They told me to move on. They said, it's the system. They said I should forgive. But how do you forgive when no one admits they were wrong? How do you forgive when no one says sorry? I went to the cemetery every week, burying not just you, but my belief that the law would protect people like us. She looked around the room, then back at Carter. You ask why I incited a crowd? I didn't do that. She did. These words did. And thousands of others carrying journals no one reads live with the same fire. I just held the microphone for them. A full minute passed. No one moved. Not a sound. The court clerk forgot to type. A security officer, once a Marine, gripped his belt as if hearing his own mother's cry after war. Carter exhaled slowly. He looked down at the file on his bench. The boy's name, now it came back, was Darnell Ruiz, 17 years old, unarmed, shot in the back while running after officers mistook his description. The officer involved had been cleared as, by protocol. The case closed in just 19 days. The report still sat in the courthouse archive, bearing the denial stamp on top, his signature. Maria turned to the final page of the journal. The handwriting shook, perhaps the last letter before the mother took her own life. But Maria didn't read this part aloud. She simply opened the page, handed it to a court officer, and quietly said, "This page, please file it in the case record. Don't let it disappear again." She scanned the room, locking eyes with each person, the jury, the reporters, the staff, the protesters. Finally, her gaze returned to Carter. "You don't need to apologize to me," she said. "But remember, the verdict doesn't end in this room. The real verdict lies in how this trial will be retold to the next generation." Carter didn't respond. He only gave a slight nod. For the first time in nearly an hour, he allowed himself to admit he had been wrong. Online, the video clip of Maria reading from the journal was spreading at lightning speed. The phrase "number her words matter" was now trending. Commentators were calling this the trial that reshaped how we define human rights in court. Politicians began mentioning Maria Lopez in morning speeches. And outside the courthouse, the crowd no longer applauded. They stood in silence, heads bowed, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. 9:41 a.m. Courtroom number 3 was no longer a legal space. It had become a place of remembrance, not officially, not by designation, but sacred enough that no one dared to break the atmosphere. Maria's reading had ended nearly 2 minutes earlier, yet no one rushed to speak. No reporters raised questions, no whispers of commentary, not even a quiet cough. Only silent stares, slouched shoulders leaning forward as if trying to carry something invisible, an emotional weight that had never existed in a criminal proceeding before. Juror number 5, a middle-aged man and former police officer, bowed his head, rubbing his temple. A ballpoint pen in his hand had snapped. He hadn't even noticed. He'd come into this courtroom thinking he was here to judge an agitator. Now he was staring into an internal mirror, wondering how many mothers like this one he had ignored. In the public gallery, a young woman in a t-shirt with the slogan, "No justice, no peace," squeezed her mother's hand. They had lost her older brother 3 years earlier during a botched traffic stop. No charges were ever filed. She had marched in every protest since, but never had she heard anything like what Maria just read. Now she cried, quietly, without sound. A veteran reporter, who had once covered Syria and Afghanistan, sat frozen, pen unmoving. He didn't write because he didn't know what to write. No headline could capture what was happening. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was a funeral for silence, and Maria had just been both pastor and pallbearer. Maria quietly closed the journal, but didn't put it back into her bag. She left it on the table as if it were a living witness. Her face remained calm, but the corners of her eyes shimmered. Not because she was weak, but because finally, after years of shouting into a void, someone had truly listened. Carter bowed his head, his hand resting on the edge of the bench, not to lean on, but to steady himself. He knew every camera in the room was pointed at him, but for the first time in his career, he didn't care. He no longer saw himself as a judge delivering verdicts. He saw himself as just one of hundreds who had once stamped a rejection and believed that was enough. He looked up slowly. "Ms. Lopez." His voice was low and heavy, as if dragging a chain of memories he had spent years avoiding. "The court acknowledges your statement." Maria gave a small nod. Carter paused. "But do you understand that what you just did exceeds the permissible bounds of this hearing?" Maria didn't respond right away. She looked at him the way one looks at someone who's lost, not with blame, but with patience. "Your Honor," she said, "when a mother has to write a journal just to be heard, maybe the definition of permissible has grown too narrow." From the public seating, a white man in a blue suit stood. He was a law professor at UC Berkeley, an expert on judicial structures. He raised his chin and looked directly at Carter. "Judge Carter, I apologize for breaking protocol, but as a citizen, I respectfully ask that this testimony be recorded not only in transcripts, but in legal precedent. We cannot continue treating those who speak up as criminals. She didn't break the law. She made the law look at itself." Carter didn't stop him. He didn't have the strength or the justification. Outside the courthouse, texts began spreading rapidly through social justice networks. "Maria just made a judge listen. No interruptions, no gavel, no objections. He listened, and within minutes, a new hashtag emerged. Number sign, he listened. A young female journalist raised her hand, speaking toward Maria. Can you tell us the name of the woman in the journal? Maria hesitated, then spoke slowly. Claudia Ruiz. Mother of Darnell Ruiz. A soft gasp escaped one of the jurors. He recognized the name. 7 years earlier, the case had made the news for a few days, then disappeared. Everyone had written it off as an unfortunate situation until Maria read those final pages of the journal. Not with words, but with tears she could no longer hold back. She once said, Maria whispered, that grief didn't kill her. Silence did. And I think we've let too many people die from that silence. Another hand went up, this time from the defense bench. An older man with silver hair, a former federal prosecutor. I've never seen a defendant make an entire courtroom reflect on itself, he said. If she agrees, I would like to motion for a postponement of charges to reassess the case in its full context. The entire room held its breath. Carter didn't respond immediately. He looked at Maria, then at the journal. He turned to the clerk and spoke, quietly but clearly. Enter into record. The court hereby pauses this hearing for 48 hours to assess the inclusion of humanitarian evidence in the criminal record. Special note, the journal of Claudia Ruiz will be fully archived and submitted as human impact evidence. Maria closed her eyes, not to rest, but to give thanks. No one could hear her words, but her lips silently moved. Thank you, Claudia. The journal still lay at the center of the table, and in that moment, it was no longer a personal belonging. It was the only candle in a room that had once gone dark, a small flame, but enough to warm everyone present, enough to help them see themselves more clearly. 9:58 a.m. Judge Carter had just ordered a 48-hour postponement to reevaluate the humanitarian factors in the case, a nearly unprecedented move in his federal courtroom. Claudia Ruiz's journal was no longer just emotional testimony. It had officially been entered into the case record as part of the human impact evidence. Though no one said it aloud, everyone in the room understood. This trial had far surpassed the bounds of conventional law. It had become a tribunal of justice, a space where truth, if strong enough, could force the system itself to stop and listen. Carter stood from the bench. He reached for a glass of water, took a deep breath, and scanned the room. Every eye was fixed on Maria, the woman who had turned worn journal pages into collective reckoning. He placed his hand on the bench, then looked straight at her. Ms. Lopez, he said slowly, the court has not officially adjourned today's session. However, I now invite you to speak again, not as a defendant, but as a citizen. If there is anything you wish to say, now is the time. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Maria no longer stood alone. Behind her were eyes filled with quiet solidarity. Before her, a stillness wide enough for words to echo. She stepped gently into the center of the floor. No microphone, no notes. Everything she needed to say, she had carried inside her for nearly a decade. Thank you, Your Honor. She looked up, not just at Carter, but at the entire courtroom, at the broadcast cameras live streaming to millions. And in that moment, her gaze no longer belonged to someone confronting the system. It belonged to someone who had once believed in it and still clung to a final shred of that belief. Earlier, someone asked why I came here. Was it to defend myself? To argue? To avoid sentencing? I came because I believe if there's one place left where words still carry weight, it has to be the courtroom. She pointed toward the journal on the clerk's desk. She, Claudia Ruiz, believed that. She believed that when everything else failed, news coverage, public opinion, protests, there would still be one place where a mother could be heard. But she was wrong, not because the court was broken, but because the people who represented it forgot something fundamental. Justice doesn't begin with statutes. It begins with the recognition of humanity. A pause, she let the sentence settle before continuing. We treat the word truth like it's something sacred, something that must be verified, cleaned, filtered through layers of procedure. But some truths don't need translating. They don't need defense. They don't need permission. They just need to be allowed to exist. And if our system only accepts truths with case numbers, then it has failed to protect the most sacred thing we have, human experience. A journalist whispered to a colleague live streaming, "She's not speaking. She's redefining what truth means." Maria continued, her voice slightly thickened, but never wavering. "I'm not a politician. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not the only victim. I'm just one wave in a much bigger tide. A tide with no banners, no slogans. It only carries unanswered questions. Why was my brother asked for ID more often than others? Why did my mother have to tell me never to run when I see a cop? Why is the word sorry never found in internal investigation reports?" She paused, looking up at Judge Carter. By now, his hands were braced on the bench, listening, but no longer wearing the cold detachment of a federal judge. There was a new crease on his brow, the kind a person earns when they realize just how much they've missed. Maria took a breath. "Judge Carter, I don't want your resignation. I'm not asking you to sign anything. I just want to ask, if Darnell Ruiz were your son, if you received this journal not as a judge, but as a father, would you have read it?" Carter tilted his head slightly. His eyes no longer saw Maria as a defendant. They saw her as someone reminding him of who he once was and what he once hoped to be. A juror broke down crying. He no longer tried to hide it. He stood up, took out a handkerchief, and quietly left the courtroom, whispering one line, "I'm sorry." No reporter followed him. No camera panned. All lenses remained on Maria, the woman who had just held up a mirror to the system without distortion. Maria went on, "I am not against the system. I'm against using the system as an excuse to avoid the truth. Because truth does not belong locked away in evidence rooms. It belongs in the light, and it must be heard, not just by the person holding the gavel, but by all of us." She took a step back, her eyes once again scanning the room. "Today, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't need an acquittal. I only hope that, when this trial ends, we don't remember it as a case where a defendant shed tears, but as the moment a community finally saw itself." Carter said nothing. He turned to the clerk and whispered something. A few seconds later, the clerk stood and announced, "This court is adjourned for 48 hours to allow additional submissions of evidence. During this period, the defendant Maria Lopez's statement shall be transcribed in full and entered into the case file under Article 14, Community Impact Documentation." A soft ripple of applause moved across the courtroom. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was gratitude without words. In the back, a television producer whispered to her cameraman, "Keep every second. No edits, no music. This is the most real thing we've ever aired." Outside, hundreds stood still, listening through speakers and live streams. When Maria exited the courthouse, no one spoke. They simply made space. An elderly woman stepped forward, not to question, but to hand her a handkerchief. Maria nodded in thanks, then walked forward, not as a defendant facing charges, but as someone who had just let the truth speak, without needing permission. 10:13 a.m. Maria stepped out of the courtroom with an eerie calm. No one stopped her. No one blocked her path with questions. In the careers of the seasoned reporters present, none had ever seen a defendant walk out of court under an atmosphere like this. Not as a victor, not as someone defeated. It was as if she had opened a door, and the entire city was hesitating, wondering whether to follow her through it. Back inside, Judge Carter remained seated, silent. Most of the jury had left for private chambers. A few reporters had rushed out to file their first breaking reports. But Carter hadn't moved. His hand still rested on the bench, eyes fixed on the old journal. He appeared to be rereading a passage, but in truth, he was reading himself. No one knew that from the moment Maria had spoken the name Claudia Ruiz, a part of Carter's memory had snapped awake. On the second floor of the courthouse, Maria stood in the hallway, looking down at the plaza below, where the crowd of demonstrators was beginning to disperse. Next to her stood a middle-aged man in a modest suit and wireframe glasses, a veteran reporter from the San Francisco Herald, who had covered high-profile trials for over 20 years. Moments earlier, he had been the first to sense something deeply unusual about Maria's connection to the woman in the journal. "Maria," he said, his voice soft and cautious, "I know you didn't intend to say anything, but is it true? Was Claudia your mother?" Maria kept her gaze on the square. "My birth mother died when I was 9, she said. Illness. She brought me into the world. But Claudia, she raised me. The sentence detonated in the journalist's mind like a bomb. "You were Claudia Ruiz's adopted daughter?" Maria turned to him and nodded gently. "She took me in when I was 12. Neither of them had any family left. Darnell was my foster brother. We lived in a small apartment near Bayview. No one paid us any attention, not until the day Darnell was shot." The reporter's throat tightened. "Why didn't you say any of this in court?" Maria gave a sad smile. "Because if I had, people would have thought I was just injecting personal emotion into a criminal proceeding. I needed them to hear her as a mother, not as the mother of the accused. I needed her words to be respected, as a citizen's truth, not as the voice of someone biologically tied to me." The reporter fell silent, stunned by Maria's restraint, by the strategy, the grace. She had chosen to remove herself from the spotlight so her mother, and all the other mothers, could stand in it. Downstairs, Carter finally rose from his bench. He requested the full case file of Darnell Ruiz. The court clerk hesitated slightly, then quickly complied. When the stack of printed documents arrived, Carter didn't dive in. He ran his hand lightly over the pages, as though they were letters he had never opened. Then he saw it, the name of the woman who had submitted the plea, Claudia Ruiz, and just beneath it, scribbled faintly in pencil at the bottom left corner of the page, was another name, Maria R. Lopez. She had helped her mother write the letter. She was the one who placed the final period in the story Carter had never truly read. Without a word, Carter walked to the second floor. No clerk, no bailiff, no announcement, just an old man in a black robe looking for a fragment of truth he'd long left behind. He stepped into the hallway where Maria stood, facing away. She heard his footsteps, turned around, and saw him. For several seconds, they stood 3 paces apart, the distance between power and understanding, between one who had judged and one who had been judged. "You knew I'd find out," Carter said. "Yes," Maria replied, "but I wanted you to find out when you were ready to hear it." Carter nodded slightly. "She raised you?" "Since I was 12. After my birth, mother died of cancer. I had no one left. Claudia was my mother's friend. She came to get me from the group shelter. No one made her. But she said, 'You won't sleep under fluorescent lights anymore. You'll sleep where there's real breathing.'" Carter listened. His eyes glistened. "You should have said that in court." Maria shook her head. "No, sir. If I'd said from the start that Claudia raised me, people would have seen me as a girl mourning her mother. But I needed them to mourn for all the mothers, the ones who don't have anyone left to speak for them." A stillness fell over the hallway. Carter nodded again, but this time slower, as if affirming something he should have understood long ago. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Maria didn't respond, but for the first time her eyes softened. She understood that the apology wasn't meant to fix anything. It was simply an overdue acknowledgement, and a necessary one. The very next day, a headline appeared in the San Francisco Herald. "The girl who read the journal in court was more than a witness. She was Claudia Ruiz's daughter." The story spread across major outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Guardian. But what shook the public wasn't the blood connection. It was Maria's choice to hide it, so the focus could remain on the community, not herself. In a later interview, when asked whether she regretted not revealing the truth earlier, Maria answered, "If I had said it, people would have seen me as a girl who lost her mother. But I wanted them to see me as a citizen trying to save a society that's grown too used to looking away. I didn't need their sympathy. I needed their awakening." 11:05 a.m. In a small office behind the third-floor hallway, Samuel Carter sat alone. His black robe hung neatly on a wooden rack, still crisp, not a single wrinkle. But he was slouched in his chair, top shirt button undone, holding a glass of water, its ice long melted. On the desk, next to a stack of unopened case files, was a newly bound copy of Claudia Ruiz's journal, stamped clearly, Human Impact Exhibit A, 048/CR. The room was nearly silent. Only the soft breath of the air conditioner and the steady thump of Carter's own heartbeat filled the space. He had sat in this chair for nearly 30 years. He had presided over weeks-long trials, heard emotional testimonies, cutting arguments, tears, even threats. But never, never had anyone made him feel like this. that he had once judged an entire life without ever truly understanding it. He opened the journal again. April 14th. I came to court alone. The man behind the desk didn't look me in the eye. He just nodded, then passed my file into another stack. I didn't know his name, but I knew that look. It was the look of someone who had seen too many files. So many he forgot each one was a person. Carter closed the journal, not in anger, not in defense. Just as a man, alone, realizing he had been that man behind the desk. He stood up and walked slowly toward a silver-framed mirror on the far wall. The frame had tarnished over the years. He looked into it, not to adjust his collar, not to fix his hair, but to see who was staring back at him after 3 decades of judging others. And for the first time, he didn't see a judge. He didn't see the law. He saw a man who had once believed he was right, a man who thought justice could be measured in clauses and precedent, but now understood he had been silent in the face of real voices. Memories echoed in his mind. His first day on the bench at 34, a young man filled with fire and ideals. He had vowed to be perfectly neutral. But as each case passed, each file thickened, he'd begun to confuse neutrality with numbness, and numbness with justice. Maria had reminded him, with a voice calm but sharp as steel, that justice isn't coldness. It's the courage to see the human being behind the law. Carter returned to his desk and powered on his computer. He typed a short email. Requesting a meeting with the full state judicial board. We need to discuss the integration of social impact evidence in criminal proceedings. A small act, but the first step. 11:48 a.m. An unofficial press conference was held in the media room downstairs. CNN, ABC, and The Hill were present. When asked about a shift in judicial philosophy, Carter stepped up to the podium. No notes, no prepared statement. I don't have a formal announcement, he began. I only have one thing to say. He looked into the camera lens. We've gotten used to judging by averages. We accept that everything can be measured, categorized, evaluated. But while we do that, we forget that an unanswered cry for help can kill an entire generation's belief in justice. He paused. Reporters scrambled to write, but quietly. I once rejected a petition from a mother named Claudia Ruiz. I didn't read it carefully enough. I thought I was following protocol, but today I realized some protocols were built to serve people, not to silence them. The room went still. No camera flashes, no clicking keyboards. Everyone was just listening. An hour later, the hashtag #JudgeCarterSpeaks began trending. On Twitter, a civil rights attorney wrote, "What changes the system isn't always a lawsuit. Sometimes it's the moment someone inside it says, 'I was wrong.'" That afternoon at his home, Carter opened an old bookshelf. He pulled down a leather-bound volume of poetry by Langston Hughes, the one who once wrote, "Justice is a blind goddess. To some she gives a sword, to some a scolding rod." He flipped open the inner cover, then picked up a pen and wrote his first inscription in decades. Justice doesn't need to be blind, it needs a heart. SC, 2025, 2:02 p.m. 2 days later. The Federal Court of San Francisco reconvened for the public hearing in the case of Maria Lopez. But this time, there were no barricades, no sirens, no angry chants. Just a long, orderly line of people, each holding a piece of paper, a handwritten phrase, or a quiet memory. It was as if everyone had brought their own version of Claudia Ruiz's journal. Maria entered the courtroom with the same calm demeanor. But today her eyes no longer carried the burden of solitude. They were the eyes of someone who knew. She was no longer alone in this fight. She wore a plain white shirt, no patterns, no makeup, no slogans. Just a new notebook, black, blank, as if to say, the next chapter we write together. Judge Carter had arrived 10 minutes earlier. No announcement, no formal escort. He opened the courtroom door himself, took his seat, and placed the gavel gently on the desk. The one striking difference, he wasn't wearing his robe. A quiet shock rippled through the room. The media buzzed. Some thought it was a technical delay, but Carter didn't let anyone speak. He stood, stepped out from behind the elevated bench, and addressed the room, not from above but from within. Today's hearing doesn't begin with power, it begins with listening. The entire room held its breath. He turned to Maria. Ms. Lopez, you have the right to remain silent, but if you still wish to speak, I will listen. Not as a judge. As a citizen, Maria didn't flinch. Yes, I will speak, but I want to hear from you, too. Carter nodded, inviting, perhaps for the first time, a true dialogue between an ordinary citizen and the very system that had once dismissed her. Maria stepped forward, placed her hand gently on the new notebook. She opened it and wrote on the first page, "There is no single owner of the truth." Then she looked at Carter. "Your Honor, you once asked me, if I didn't break the law, what exactly did I break? Today I have an answer. I broke complacency. I broke the silence you and many others once called neutrality. I didn't come here to oppose the law. I came to ask it to look at itself." Carter responded, his voice low, no longer brittle but grounded. "You're right. I once believed silence was objectivity, but now I realize it was just a way to avoid responsibility. And if I mishandled Claudia Ruiz's case, it wasn't just my mistake. It was a systemic failure." Maria stepped closer. Now only 3 paces separated them. Her voice sharpened, firm for the first time, like a cross-examination. "Then what do you intend to do about it, sir?" Carter met her gaze. "I can't rewrite the past, but I can ensure the future doesn't repeat it. Is that promise on paper?" "Not yet." "Then today, we write it." Carter signaled the clerk to bring a blank sheet of paper and a pen to the table. He asked, "What do you want me to write?" Maria answered without hesitation, "I want you to acknowledge, in writing, that justice isn't only about following the law. It's also about honoring the human spirit behind it." And then, before a full courtroom and millions watching the live broadcast, Samuel Carter, the man once seen as the embodiment of unshakable legal logic, picked up the pen and wrote, "I, Samuel Carter, acknowledge that in my pursuit of law, I once overlooked the human being. From this day forward, every ruling issued under my name will begin with listening and end with humanity." A wave surged through the courtroom. No applause. Everyone stood, as if bidding farewell to something old and welcoming something reborn. Maria looked at the paper and nodded. "Today, I don't need forgiveness. I just need power to be willing to engage. And today, I received that." Carter returned to his desk. For the first time in his career, he didn't adjourn with the gavel. He placed it down gently, face up, its wooden head turned outward, as if to remind everyone, justice isn't a tool to silence voices. It's a tool to defend against silence itself. Outside the courtroom, no protest broke out, no chaos. But people walked slowly, as though they had just witnessed a revolution, bloodless, bannerless, leaderless. Just one person brave enough to tell a story, and one person brave enough to finally listen. Friday morning, 9 a.m., all of America held its breath. The media called it the most anticipated trial since George Floyd. But the people used simpler words. The trial where finally everyone was heard. Millions tuned in, TVs, phones, iPads, not to witness a sentencing, but to see if for once the system would place its heart on the same scale as the law. Courtroom number 3, 3rd floor, Federal Courthouse in San Francisco, had been rearranged. But this time, there were no dividers between the press, the public, and the jury. A special layout, open, flat, without hierarchy. An idea approved by none other than Judge Carter, who had refused all symbols of authority since the day Maria read the journal aloud. Outside, Civic Center Plaza was silent. No protests, no banners, just a massive LED screen broadcasting the entire hearing. Beneath it, thousands sat shoulder to shoulder, as if attending a collective memorial. 9:08 a.m., the court clerk announced, resuming the hearing of Maria Lopez, continued by order of the court, to deliver the final verdict. The air was dense. Maria sat still, eyes down. Her hand rested on the black notebook, now filled with 8 new testimonies submitted by other mothers over the past 2 days. Carter stepped to the bench. Today he wore a white shirt and a blue tie. No robe, no gavel, no shield of rank. He stood for a moment before the microphone, then began. Today, this court will not read the charges. It will not revisit the indictment. It will not reanalyze the facts, because we have all heard not only the defense, but the voices of those who are no longer with us. And today, I believe silence is no longer an option. He looked across the courtroom, from reporters to jurors, citizens to international observers. This court hereby declares the defendant, Maria Lopez, is not to be prosecuted under Article 134 for the alleged incitement of public disorder. Reason: her actions do not constitute a crime. They constitute the voice of a community long abandoned. The cameras clicked, but no applause followed. The room froze, then dissolved into a quiet, collective reverence that needed no sound. Carter continued. However, this court will not conclude this case with a mere "not guilty." It will conclude with a recommendation. He held up a small file folder, stamped in blue ink. This is a proposal from this court to the Governor of California and the U.S. Department of Justice, requesting the formal establishment of a new judicial branch, the Human Impact Division, a unit responsible for receiving, evaluating, and reviewing social impact evidence in all cases involving community justice. The courtroom was stunned. Carter pressed on. In addition, this court requests the reopening of 37 cases over the past 10 years involving law enforcement violence, where social evidence may have been overlooked, including the case of Darnell Ruiz. The investigation will be led by an independent panel composed of community representatives, human rights attorneys, and constitutional scholars. Maria bowed her head, not in exhaustion, but because the story she had carried was now officially on the table of law. Across America, something began to shift. Online, the hashtag #HIDACT, Human Impact Division Act, began trending. High school students formed writing groups to petition their states to adopt a new program called Justice Lab, to study trials like Maria Lopez's as living history. Back in the courtroom, Carter turned toward her one last time. Ms. Maria Lopez, you didn't just deliver testimony, you delivered a path that, if we have the courage to follow it, might be the way forward for millions who feel left behind. Maria looked at him and nodded gently. She said, without a microphone, without amplification, "Thank you, but I'm just the one holding the mirror. It's up to us to decide if we're brave enough to look in." Carter smiled, the first real smile in his 30 years on the bench. In the back row, a 12-year-old boy pulled out his phone and texted his friend. She didn't get pardoned. She got recognized. Monday, 7:03 a.m. Los Angeles woke up to soft skies, misty, cool, but not cold. A morning without press conferences, no live streams, no public statements. But for Maria Lopez, today wasn't like other days. Not because of a meeting, not because of a speech, but because, for the first time since everything happened, she returned to the West Point Bank, not for business. She walked into the lobby with a quiet, familiar presence. White shirt, gray jeans, no makeup, no entourage. Just a small leather notebook and a pen. No name tag, no podium, no titles. The branch was still waking up. Employees were setting up their counters. The receptionist looked up, recognized her immediately, but said nothing. She just gave a quiet nod. The kind of nod you give someone who's walked through a storm and come out with clear eyes. 1 week after the verdict, nothing had radically changed. No sweeping orders from Washington, no giant reform signs hanging from courthouses. But something had shifted. At Berkeley and Stanford, law offices launched new seminars titled Justice and Humanity. The Oregon State Court began piloting a program called hearing rooms, spaces where citizens could share personal stories before major hearings. A new division quietly formed within the Department of Justice. Official name: Division of Narrative Evidence. No building yet, no confirmed staff. But one thing was certain. It began with Maria and Claudia's story. On TV, a short clip kept replaying from a recent interview. "I never meant to become a symbol," Maria said. "I just did what everyone should be allowed to do. Tell the story of someone they love, and if the system ever thought that wasn't relevant, then maybe the system wasn't relevant." Carter retired a month after the trial. No farewell party, no public letter. Just a handwritten note sent to Maria. "You reminded me that justice isn't a destination, it's how we walk. Thank you for making me stop and look at my own feet. Samuel Carter." On June 15th, a memorial was held in Oakland. No stage, no music, just 100 wooden chairs. On each chair sat a small black notebook. On the cover, "Voices Once Interrupted." Each person received a pen. No one was told what to do. By the end, they collected 92 notebooks, filled with stories no one had ever asked about. Maria arrived late. She didn't sit. She stood at the entrance, watching the empty chairs. Then quietly, she pulled out a new notebook and wrote on the first page, "We can't bring back justice for the ones we've lost, but we can keep them from being forgotten." At the end of June, a high school student in Detroit submitted an essay titled, "I Want to Be Like Maria," not because she won, but because she listened when no one did. The essay won a national award. The teacher's comment in red ink read, "You've learned something many adults haven't. Listening is an act of justice." That 4th of July, in the Washington, D.C. parade, between military trucks and cavalry riders, a group of high school students marched silently carrying 50 black notebooks. No chants, no signs, just a line of words taped to the back cover. Justice doesn't begin with a weapon. It begins with a story heard all the way through. Maria didn't attend. She was in a small classroom in Fresno, teaching a workshop on personal testimony and public policy reform. She wrote on the board, "Every system has two chambers, one of law, one of conscience." A student asked, "Do you believe justice will ever be perfect?" Maria smiled, then replied, "Justice doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs enough people who won't give up." 1 year later, Claudia Ruiz was honored at Central Park in Oakland. Her plaque read, "The Silent Mother Who Made a Nation Listen." Below it, in smaller letters, "And her daughter turned that whisper into a bell." The story of Maria Lopez did not end with a verdict. It ended with a shift. Not loud, not branded, just one woman who stood up, and a system that, for the first time, sat down to listen. She had no weapons, no titles. She didn't win with laws. She won with truth. And that truth was written in the tears of mothers who had never been heard, in the pages of journals the system once labeled inadmissible. Judge Carter never shed a tear, but he laid down his gavel, not to silence, but to step away from imposing. He left the highest seat in the room not because he lost, but because he had finally realized justice does not sit above us. It sits in our willingness to reflect. So what does it take to still a courtroom, to change a judge, to awaken a nation? Not outrage, not protest, but a quiet voice, strong enough to pierce through layers of indifference. You see, change doesn't always arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it comes in the form of a girl, standing alone, holding an old notebook, and it's the decision not to shout back, not to run, not to retaliate, but to stay and tell the truth all the way through, that made the world finally pause. This story leaves us with questions that are painfully real. How many journals are still sitting unread on the desks of those in power? How many people have written in desperation with no reply? How many voices were cut off simply because they had no title, no lawyer, no platform? And most of all, are you truly listening or just waiting for your turn to speak? This isn't the kind of story you nod at and move on. It's the kind of story you rise from, walk out the door, and ask, who is the next Claudia we're overlooking? Who is the next Maria waiting for a chance to be heard? If your heart was stirred by this story, don't let that feeling fade like a short clip. Comment below, have you ever been ignored when telling the truth? Have you seen someone silenced simply because no one was listening? We read everything, and maybe your story is the next bell that needs to be heard. If you believe justice isn't a privilege, but a basic human right, like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to explore more real stories that challenge society to think deeper, and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single voice waiting to be heard. We can't change the past, but we can make sure that next time, when someone dares to speak, someone will be listening.